I won't say too much by way of introduction, but I'll just read quite briefly. Pioneering critic and curator Bill Arning gives a talk tonight about his love affair with the arts, from New York to Houston to Manchester, from art in the age of AIDS to institutional critique, from relational aesthetics to new media, from feminist painting to Stonewall 50 this last year. Warning, this curator's talk, true to the speaker's queer punk rocker origins, is guaranteed to give offense to some and to encourage the provocative proclivities, you give me a tongue twister here, provocative proclivities of others. So let's please give a warm welcome to
Well, I am a native New Yorker, and the fact that I left here, which someone just pointed out 20 years ago this year, but I'm still here a lot because the art world is basically, most of what I do is based here at some point. And the talk really began with, I was asked to look at my curatorial history over time. And I realized the different places and eras I'd lived through had really shaped what was a conspicuous sensibility. And when I was asking the talk, they said, you do so much around queer aesthetics. What do queer aesthetics mean? So I looked at where that came out of. And as I mentioned, my coming out years didn't happen in a gay bar. They happened at CBGB's. I dated the doorman. The bass player in my band was the bartender. I had more makeout sessions at CBGB's and saw all the bands at this point. And it's where I learned what art was supposed to be. Art was supposed to be dangerous. It was supposed to be if you went home and told your parents, oh, I'm going to work in the arts, they should be like, oh, no, that's like a bad thing. They should not picture you like writing about papers on Rubens. They should imagine you like getting arrested at something. And then I began in the early 80s at a space called White Columns that's still very much alive and thriving. And right as my curatorial voice was firming, I had the moment of what I call the second coming out. I had come out as a person in my mid-teens without much difficulty. I had an older sister who was in acting school. I had liberal parents. There was no big deal about coming out. But AIDS radicalized my whole generation, and it made it that my life as a curator and my life as a gay man were all getting interwoven. Sort of most infamously, when I was running a space called White Columns when it was on West Spring Street, and it had this storefront, and ACT UP had formed at this point, and we were, and they came to me and they were like, can we use the space in July and August when you're closed? And I'm like, sure, why? They're like, we just want to put up all the ACT UP posters. And I'm like, and then one of the guys wanted to test my metal and was like, oh, Bill, do you have plate glass insurance? And I'm like, yeah. They're like, well, because we're going to have Reagan guilty of murder in the window. So and since you're on the on-ramp for the tunnel, someone might shoot out your window. So we just want to make sure you got plate glass insurance. And I'm like, okay, yeah, we had that. No one actually did take the windows out, but it was very much of a defining moment for my understanding of what art could be. So then, after I left White Columns in like 96, and I thought the museum world was going to just welcome me with open arms because I had a reputation. The museum world had different ideas. They were like, oh no, he's trouble. And they did not invite me to start doing shows in MoMA the way I thought was going to happen. But I did end up getting a job at MIT List Visual Arts Center. MIT List Visual Arts Center is a museum in Cambridge, Mass. That has a very much of an experimental sensibility. And everyone that worked there, my boss there, Jane Farver, the assistant director, Dave Freylock, they had all come out of alternative spaces. They had all had the same non-traditional museum backgrounds, and they wanted what I had. And suddenly, and I had always sort of like had a sort of science fetish. I always loved reading Science Times and stuff. And I got a lot of experience there actually working with arts-friendly scientists. And one of the best parts of my job was they were all these visiting artist programs there, and they would get intimidated by the world-class, brilliant people at the Institute, and they didn't know who, and I ended up learning this menu of scientists and who was open to having artists, filmmakers, writers, poets come in their laboratories. Two of the shows that I'm most proud of, there, Currin and Glenn, who's a really grand Welsh queen, did a show with me there, Thoughts Unsaid, Now Forgotten. And it was really a long research project on the amount of radical thought that had happened at MIT. So you've got, like Noam Chomsky's office was like across the street. And I always had this idea I'd see Chomsky like ordering a chicken salad sandwich in the deli. That never actually happened. I ran into him by chance twice in my 10 years there. But like there were other people like Evelyn Fox Keller, the feminist science historian, was there. And she was willing to collaborate on a piece with Kathe. And it was kind of amazing. There was this giant plate glass window that looked out on this atrium. This was out from the gallery. So he put in neon backwards, Thoughts Unsaid, Now Forgotten, and the window was roughly the scale of a movie screen. So you would see these incredible scientists walk past, and you wonder what was in their head. So suddenly you had this like living subtitle of Thoughts Unsaid, Now Forgotten. Next to it was Stan Vanderbeek. For the 150th anniversary of the Institute, my boss said, can you find something that happened here that's worthy of a historical show? And Vanderbeek was the guy who basically invented new media when the term had no agreed upon meaning, when you would make new media with basically popsicle sticks and a soldering iron. And he had died very quickly. He had the good fortune that his two youngest kids were both artists, became well-known artists, and we were able to reconstruct these things he had done early on. Interestingly, his trajectory anticipated mine by a few decades, and he ended up following mainframe computers because they were rare at that point. The amount of calculating power you have on your phone, there were like 3 computers that strong in all of the country, and there was one at MIT and there was one at NASA in Houston. So he went down there trying to get access, and he would do things like these giant media installations. And John de Menil, the founder of the Menil collection, had asked Andy Warhol who he should bring to found a new media center. And he says, and he had gone up to this thing where this dome Vanderbeek had built where you could bring your own beamers and just project stuff. And he was like, and Vanderbeek, Warhol told John de Menil to bring him down. Turns out John de Menil was not actually looking for crazy new media. I also got to do the first significant museum show with A.A. Bronson at MIT, which is something I could do there because it was a museum that didn't worry about, because it had your prime audience was Harvard and MIT students. So you had some of the brightest people on the planet as your first audience. So AA was part of a collective called General Idea. The other 2 guys died from AIDS in 1994, and he had taken 5 years trying to figure out who he was. And this is an image of one of his partners in the group, Felix Gonzalez, an hour after he had died. And by the time this show happened at MIT, and this piece was also a billboard-sized piece. It was 10 by 14 feet. And by the time this had come, AIDS was no longer causing wasting like this, so people hadn't seen the walking skeletons, which was so much a part of my generation. And I remember the young students were like, what is that? How is that possible? And we had to talk about what the history was. Interestingly, there were 3 chairs to symbolize the 3 members of General Idea. And people would sort of slump back into them. And I was taking people to the show all the time, and they wouldn't talk about AIDS or their inheritance life, which is what I thought they would talk about. They would just start talking about whoever was the most recent person they loved that died. So I was having these conversations like, oh, my aunt died last week. Just these things that it was interesting, the idea of this sort of universality of this. And one of the most fun projects I worked on was the Chantal Akerman show, which was both going to be co-produced by Houston and MIT. Akerman was the great lesbian feminist filmmaker. Probably her movie, Jean Dielman, is one of the great feminist films of all time. And the Blaffer, the other museum in Houston, was working the retrospective, invited us to collaborate. So Chantal was a visiting artist at MIT, and I got to shepherd her around. It was interesting because she's very much of her generation. She passed away a few years ago, but the films were just really beautiful and really wonderfully sad. And so I got to bring that down there. I got the call in 2009. The job was available in Houston. I had luckily juried a Houston area show for the Blaffer Museum, so I knew the scene there was lively, so I wasn't scared. My Cambridge, people call Cambridge the People's Republic of Cambridge for a reason. It's got one of the highest Marxist, very intellectual Marxist populations, and people are like, you're moving to Texas? They have guns there. And I was like, I had spent time there, so I was really intrigued by the thought of going to Texas. So I started trying to learn the culture. First off, are there any actually native Texans in the room? Okay. So you know that in Texas, they give you Texas history in school. Like you get this like that. So the first thing I did was I went out and bought like a giant book of Texas history so I could know what people knew and what the Texas Rangers were and all this stuff. And then I started looking at just the geography, like when Texas was just like a section of Mexico. Which also like is really good to remember politically now because it's still most of the place. If you're down in San Antonio, still feels like you're definitely in Mexico. And then also just looking at the relative size of this thing. It's bigger than most countries in Europe. There is actually a T-shirt you will see of the outline of Texas greater than France. Just to remind you that it's bigger than the entire country of France, which also meant for me there's Texas art history that you have to learn. You probably know the name, but I had no idea the world's most famous sculptor was Jim Love until I moved there. And Jim Love is in every Texas museum collection. If you go to the Manil, there's a giant Jim Love outside. The museum where I worked for 10 years, there was doing Jim Love's retrospective when Jim Love died. And there was this weird, a show that cost $200,000 to produce suddenly raised $800,000 in donations because he died before the show opened. Everyone sent tribute money, so they had to figure out what to do with an extra $600,000 of tribute to Jim Love. So I'm learning Texas art history, but also cultural history. One of the other museum directors, when I got the job, said, "Send me a copy of this book called The Big Rich." The money in Texas happened really quickly. When oil was discovered by a group called the Wildcatters. The Wildcatters, who could smell oil, they were deep. They were not educated. They were deeply religious. The origin of the political dynamic that dominates the country today is because of the Wildcatters suddenly becoming the wealthiest people on the planet. There's a movie that, if you've never seen Giant, is basically the story of how Houston happens. And there's a great scene early in the film. Liz Taylor is from Maryland. She's got a wealthy dad. Rock Hudson shows up in his pretending to be straight mode and is trying to buy a racehorse. And he ends up coming home with Elizabeth Taylor. And she goes to the ranch. She looks around. And she's like, "Oh fuck, what did I do?" She doesn't say "oh fuck," but and they do this dish where they put the cow's head in embers for 24 hours, and then they lop the top of the head off and ladle out the brains. And Liz Taylor watches this and passes out. And she wakes up the next day and she goes, "Tell the men of this ranch they'll never see me faint again." And I kept using that line my whole first year. There's the James Dean character in this is based on a real person. He builds this crazy hotel, which was in Houston, called the Shamrock, and he gets too drunk to even attend his own opening. Then we have that little issue of the hurricanes. It's like every time, and the storms hit Houston, Houston floods all the time. When I got there, I had never owned a car before because I lived in Boston and New York, who would own a car? And then I get there, like, you need a car. And I go and buy a little lesbian car, a little Scion XB. And my friends are like, "Oh, well, it floods here. You're gonna have to stay home like half the year." And I was just like, good. I've got a reason to not go to stuff then. But then it's like the liberal progressive tradition there is amazing. You've got Ann Richards, whose daughter is now the head of Planned Parenthood, one of the most fascinating human beings in the whole history of America. She was the governor of Texas, one of the great voices. Her biography, I think Let the People Speak, is one of the great books, really inspirational. Molly Ivins was a nationally syndicated newspaper columnist, one of the great liberal voices. They both died really, really young, but they're like incredibly strong democratic women. And then the goddess Barbara Jordan. God, I thought I'd fix that, the doubling thing. Anyway, the Barbara Jordan is an incredible person. She could have been the first woman on the presidential ticket. She was up to be vice president and under Mondale's ticket. And she was also relatively out. She had a lifelong female lover, and then she was diagnosed with cancer when she was about to go up and be nominated for vice president. She had to call Mondale. I was like, I can't do it. I'm not going to live long enough. And she's just an incredible person, and her voice. If you just get a chance later on to Google on YouTube Barbara Jordan's pictures, she had this incredible speaking voice. Donald Moffat, who's an artist from Texas, grew up in Houston, his family lives in San Antonio. He did this piece where he just took, this is the Texas State Legislature, and he re-photographed the photos of 10 years, and it's a bunch of white dudes and Barbara Jordan. Every year, there's one face that's not male and one face that's not white, and it's Barbara Jordan. And there's a video installation that goes with it, which is just a projection on a gold painting of Barbara Jordan lecturing. There was a famous professor of speech at Texas Southern University who taught black folks. He was like, look, if you're gonna compete, you're gonna learn to speak as if you went to the finest British school. And a lot of really powerful national figures came out of this program, including Barbara Jordan. I also, both of these people were really active when I first got there. Anise Parker is the only out gay mayor of a major city, of one of the top 10 cities in America. She was the mayor for the first 6 years I was in Houston. My first 6 months there, she got elected, and I went to her inauguration, which was down at the Opera House. And I don't know how I got a ticket, but they're like, oh, there, and I was there. She came on stage with her wife of Kathe, of like 30 years, her 3 kids, multiracial family, and on stage she goes, look, 2 women, multiracial family, this is the Houston of the future. And I just totally burst into tears, and she was amazing. Our current mayor, Sylvester Turner, is pretty great too. And Ray Hill is the guy who founded the gay political movement in Texas. There's a great documentary about him called The Trouble with Ray. I don't even know if is it available on streaming? Do you know? It's supposed to be available sometime soon. I'm trying to get the screenings of it. One thing that's funny, if you get to see The Trouble with Ray, he lived in a hovel, and the filmmaker asked if he could borrow my dining room to interview Ray in it. So there's this Lycia Scavenge watercolor behind him in the whole thing, and people thought Ray had this really great art collection because of that film. And it's like, no, that's my living room. That was my dining room. He passed away last year, really moving, because he was so famously difficult. He would call the mayor. There was one of the great early things. Do you know the Anita Bryant history? One of the great people, anti-gay forces, and the movement against Anita Bryant was one of the things that came together. She was appearing as a singer, not as a political speaker, at the Texas Bar Association conference. And Ray always had the mayor's direct line, called the mayor and said, hey, we're having a protest against the Anita Bryant thing. And the mayor's like, yeah, how many people? 200 people you gonna get? And he's like, oh yeah, we're 200. He goes, oh, Ray, you're not getting 200 people for that. It's so academic. He got 2,000 people with whistles. And the lawyers at the Bar Association thing couldn't hear themselves inside. So they ended up making Anita Bryant leave so that they could actually go on about their business. So Ray's an incredible personality. But then there's also, I'm a music head, and I always look at the music history of places. There's a type of psychedelia that overlap with the art world. The Red Krayola were active in Houston, but then Mayo Thompson, who founded the Red Krayola, is also, just saw a big retrospective of his paintings in Berlin. There's a type of hip hop called, it's screw down hip hop, I figured called DJ Screw. DJ Screw, there was a type of drug that was taken in Texas that wasn't, and it was in a lot of the southern part of America, which was called either drank or syrup, which is cooked down codeine syrup. And if you've heard DJ Screw, it's really slow. It sounds like this. And when I was at the museum, we had a music historian, David Dove, came and gave a talk about DJ Screw's importance as a composer. And he started making these comparisons with Ornette Coleman and stuff. And at the end of the talk, he was like, someone's like Professor Dove, this is the longest talk I've ever heard on DJ Screw that didn't cover the drugs. And Dave's like, well, I'm expert on the music. I'm not an expert on the drugs. And then one of the women said, oh, you should be. Those summer nights of making out in car hoods to DJ Screw. And then one of the great figures of music history is Jandek, who was self-released something like 75 albums under the name Jandek on Corward Industries. And some music curator in Edinburgh tracked him down to a Houston suburb. And Jandek will still perform occasionally. You never know if you're gonna get the 4-hour cry from the heart. Like, I went to see him at Lawndale Art Center about a year and a half ago, and he came out just shrieking, and it was like, oh, this is gonna be a long one. And then I saw him like 6 months earlier, and he had fallen in love, and he was suddenly like, Jandek in love just sounds like David Byrne. There's the part of the city that everyone hangs out in is called Montrose. And this mural, which was the Mary's mural, was on one of the main thoroughfares. So this is, everyone in the city saw this mural. There's a group of non-gay artists under the thing called the Joanna, and they grew up like seeing this mural all the time, and they decided to recreate it in one of their shows, because this was the symbol that Montrose was a different place. Everyone in Houston knows the name of the cat is Balls the cat, because he had balls, big balls, and he would lick them all the time. And so the group of artists managed to get permission to paint it back on the spot where it had been. It was they only got to put it up for 6 months, but it was back there, so everyone took their photo in front of it. Now this is a young artist, Jesse Trevino, who decided to take the habitués of the city today. This is all divided to daddies and sons, and he recreated using the Mary's mural setup. So this is a symbol for the city of Houston. There's a love of outsiderdom there. This is the beer can house. When he retired, John, he decided to cover his house with beer cans, flattened out. And this still exists today. You can go visit the beer can house. There's a 250,000 beer cans on the outside. He got as many beer cans as he could. And then the Orange Show, where this other man decided to do a tribute to the perfect food, the orange. And if you go there, you can get a Xerox of his writings for $1 each, and explains that if you eat an orange a day, you'll still be having sex when you're 90. I'm working on a proposal for a history of queer arts of Texas. And it starts really with the figure of Forrest Bess, who you may have seen. The work's been at the Whitney. There was a retrospective at the Whitney. Bess is a very odd figure because he's not an outsider in the normal sense of the word. He was very networked in. He ran a space called the Midtown Gallery in Houston with a group of other artists. He showed at Betty Parsons' gallery alongside Jackson Pollock. But he lived as a bait fisherman, digging worms and selling to fishermen to pay his bills, on a shack on the bay in Baytown, which is outside of Houston. He described in his writings that he was a homosexual of the rough variety, and other homosexuals didn't want to have anything to do with him. When he was in the Navy, he was a drinker, and he came on to another sailor who tried to kill him with a metal pipe. And after that, he started having visions where these paintings would come to him whole, and he would recreate them. He didn't care about the objects particularly. And he had these theories, and you can see this is some of the symbol systems he uses. But he got involved in a correspondence with a sexologist in the 60s called John Money. Money may or may not be the person who invented the term transsexual. There's debate about whether he was the first person to use the term. But he did have this idea of the sacred hermaphrodite. So Bess actually performed surgery on himself to open what he called his pseudo-vagina to become a pseudo-hermaphrodite. And this did not kill him. He actually reopened his scrotum 3 times to try to become immortal. There's a really great documentary about him. There's all this correspondence. He tried to get Betty Parsons to write his theorem of sexuality and show it with the paintings. And she's like, Forrest, you're a great painter. I don't want to turn the paintings into illustrations of your theory. I'll take the image out. I see everyone having looks in their faces like they're going to die. I was watching the documentary about him on my laptop on a plane from New York to Houston, and the scene of the scrotum being sliced. I was next to a big Bubba businessman. It's amazing how far he got away from me on 2 seats on a plane. And actually, Robert Gober, the artist, Bob Gober, has organized a couple retrospectives of Bess's work. But there's really some great outsiders. Like, this is Bert Long, who was one of the craziest characters. He was bigger than me, incredible personality. This is the eye field he'd done in the black section of town. And he was one of the people that founded what was this bizarre Houston tradition called the Art Car Parade. Where people decorate their cars. That's the Brunhilde one that plays the Ride of the Valkyrie. And Bert was one of the founders. And this is like a real tradition. I realized I was actually Houstonian when I was asked to be a judge of the Art Car Parade and to sit in the reviewing stand. And also, Houston is it's a city where there's been a real active black arts community since the beginning. And this is one of the most incredible spaces called Project Row Houses. Which is a type of indigenous architecture, and they let artists go in. But Project Row is like really a hard thing to decide what they do because they have a community garden, they've got community film nights, they have counseling for young women, they have they do everything in the Third Ward. This is another one of those things. But then this other side of the city is this incredibly refined aesthetic. John and Dominic de Menil were community activists. They came from France and they moved there to make money in the oil industry. And they had this idea. There's a marvelous story in the new biography of them called Double Vision that Dominique was growing up and she was wealthy in this town in France. And they would put up a giant Christmas tree and cover it with toys. And the day after Christmas, her job was to take the toys off the tree, wrap them up, and give them to the poor of the town. And she said that even as a young girl, she decided she loved beautiful things and loved giving them away. And ideologically, the Menils always free. It's one of the top 10 museums on the planet. It's walking distance from my house, which I love, that I can stroll over there. And they're open till 7 every night so that you can just go after work in regular human hours. And they had this incredible, this is Jerry McKeague in the middle, who did this show called Totem Not Taboo that's always there in the art history books for one of the first mixings of high and low. And then also Walter Hopps, the curator, was the first curator of the Menil. He was one of the founders in LA. There's a button you still see around that says Walter Hopps will be here in 15 minutes because he was never on time for anything. And he also never finished his essays on his own. He had to have someone walking behind him with a tape recorder and an ashtray and he sort of was one of the great models of the city. When I first got there, there was a show called No Zoning. Houston is famous for having no zoning, and it was all about the fact that artists just do what they want in the city. Like, no one ever told anyone they can't do something there. So next year did Havel Rock Project, who cut out the middle part of a house and then left the house standing. And I went to visit it right before it got totally condemned. So, and there were just tons of characters. Like Derek Bossier, who, if you don't know him, he's a British pop artist. And he's same generation as David Hockney. really, and they were best friends, not gay in life. But he moved to Houston because he thought it was a wacky idea. And he did paintings of naked cowboys. These are like humongous paintings of naked cowboys. There's some, I didn't find one where they have guns and boners, but there's a lot of Derek Bossier ones that have that. Then also, what he's probably best known for my generation, is he did the cover of David Bowie's Lodger album, of David Bowie like falling from the heavens. So if you saw the Bowie retrospective in the book, then there was a lot of Derek Bossier in that. He's still alive. He lives in LA, making films now. So in all my years in New York, I gave a lot of people their first shows, and you'd always joke like, oh, one day I'll be curating your retrospective. And the only case that really happened in was Marilyn Minter. And I was amazed that I got to do the show. It came here to the Brooklyn Museum. And it started with the early photorealist work that most people did not know, and I thought that was really fascinating. But what was most interesting was these paintings are now, they're from the mid to late 80s, the porn paintings. She was asked, she said, well, what are women not allowed to paint? It was like, you can't paint porn. So she goes, okay, I'm going to paint porn. I love the story that also the person who owns these paintings, this grid to today, went to the studio and said, Marilyn, you cannot show these to anyone. This will ruin your career. She cried afterwards, and then he called a day later and said, I'm going to buy them. Weirdly, when the show was up, she gave an interview to Art Forum where she said, I was the source of all the porn. And I do remember she sent over one of her interns, who was like this little fresh-faced kid, to like pick it up, and was just like, because she calls, like, do you have any porn you're bored with? And I'm like, everyone does. And I was like, so I called Marilyn. I said, I'm pretty sure only the male blowjob on the bottom right was mine, but I'm happy to take credit for the whole thing. Interestingly, every museum that showed the show built a little room to control these things, so you keep kids out of them. And like UBS, the bank, was like one of our sponsors, and we had all these UBS parties during it. And the handler for the UBS bankers was like, oh no, they can't see the porn paintings. And I'm like, they're bankers. They've probably seen porn before. And this guy was like, no. And I'd like, but then when they installed the show at the Brooklyn Museum, I walked in, because I wasn't there for the install of it, and I walked in and the porn is just in the middle of the room. And I said to the director of the Brooklyn Museum, I'm like, honey, you didn't like isolate the paintings at all? She goes, honey, we're Brooklyn. And I was like, you go. One of my favorite projects was I got to curate the Mark Flood survey. Mark is my doppelganger. We're almost exactly the same age. He began with a punk rock band as I did. He's gay, I'm gay, and he also likes to upset people. His punk rock band, their first single was Consider Museums as Concentration Camps for Art. He was working at the Manila at that point and decided this was a good attitude. The Eat Human Flesh painting is a famous success to Scandal because he says in his interviews, he traded it to his drug dealer and the drug dealer hung it in their window. And this was the time when the idea of Satan teens was freaking people out everywhere. And the police were apparently driving through the Montrose area, saw Eat Human Flesh on the window, went in and seized the painting, which of course made Mark incredibly happy that the police would actually seize the painting. So he made 20 more of them and started giving them out as like party gifts. So Mark was considered a badass, and museums were basically scared of him. And we communicated really well. And so I took him to lunch one day. I said, Mark, you want a retrospective? He's like, oh, fuck no. And I'm like, how about a survey show? Oh, fuck no. What do you want, Mark? He's like, I want a greatest hits show. So we decided we'd do a greatest hits show. He's a true believer. He doesn't like the idea of celebrity in the art world. So he has hired these two twin brothers to play him for all of his openings. He flies them around the world. And for the opening of the greatest hits show, he had them in a cage. And they each had like my name is Mark Flood stickers on them. When Mark has the openings, he always goes to see whatever the #1 movie in America is that night. So he's in a movie theater 10 blocks away seeing the movies. He also made 5,000 like signs, and people started throwing them at the poor twins in this cage. And I felt bad for them. They kept being bonked in the head. They weren't heavy, but they were still, they were getting bludgeoned with light signs. At the end of the night, they were let out, and they went running down the block, and I was like, oh my God, I think they were upset. And I saw them the next day, and they're like, no, we just had to pee, and we didn't, it's gonna be anticlimactic to pee in the museum. He also, he won't do anything normal. He's like, you have to have an introductory text. And I'm like, yeah, you kind of have to, and I gotta call you a hometown hero. So he said, I'll make him do a painting. So everything here is by Mark Flood, famous, successful, insert hometown hero narrative. Mark Flood doesn't like explaining his, lets the audience figure it out for themselves. Mark Flood is somebody who did something somewhere, formerly nowhere. Mark Flood lives in Houston. So the entire introductory text became this 18-foot high painting. I said, you can do it as long as it doesn't fall over. I just got invited to at Mindy Solomon's gallery in Miami to do a show of Mark Flood's paintings from the 80s and 90s. And I think he's basically one of the people who invented institutional critique. He did these things, which is like a fundraising letter. John Peters was his first name, one of the first names. So he got his fundraising letter for the going out. So he just made a Xerox and blew it up into painting form. I think it's really successful work. So that's going to be during Art Basel Miami. And one thing Mark loves to do is he loves to support younger artists. So this artist Sam Jablon, who's here in New York now, is someone Mark's been buying work by and really likes. So it's a 2-artist show called Dirty Words with Sam Jablon and Mark Flood. Thedra Cullar-Ledford is one of the most tough-ass painters I know. When I first got there, she was doing these doll paintings, paintings of socialites with doll bodies with Uzis. And then she was diagnosed with a type of breast cancer that still requires mastectomy. Most breast cancers don't anymore. So she did these pieces. There's an art historical image of St. Agatha who's always presented with her breasts on a tray. And so she made breasts on a tray. She had these giant boob piñatas. And people who had when she had the mastectomy, she chose to not reconstruct. And that's a real feminist thing because you can get, and some women have been actually declared insane for not wanting to reconstruct. And she said, look, having plastic in my body is the reason I think I have cancer. I don't want to add more plastic to my body. So she got people from the Flat is Fabulous movement who've chosen to not reconstruct to help burst this. Each of the candies here has "fuck cancer" written on it. And what's been, I've seen the piece done a few times now. Each time women who had never come out as having had mastectomies suddenly rip their shirts off and grab sticks and start beating this. One time, with this performance at the museum, one of the guys, his wife had not taken her shirt off since she had a mastectomy. She suddenly ripped her shirt off, starts beating this, and he bursts into tears. He's just like, I can't believe she's doing this. I can't believe this artist has empowered her to feel good about this. These are in, this one's in the show I have now, the No Trigger Warning show. She's one of the women that has a great deal of female ejaculate when she has sex. And she does these really beautiful drawings where she has sex on paper, and then she puts on a black light thing and outlines it in graphite. And she's like, and I really had no experience with this. I had to read the Wikipedia page about female ejaculate. I had there's a really great lesbian comic from Austin named Ariel Isaac Norman, and she was doing a routine about her female ejaculate. So it's a thematic, it's going on. So one reason the Stonewall 50 stuff got really busy for me last year was I had worked on a show at the museum, which was on for Stonewall 50, and then I left the museum, so they took the show apart. So I got invited to recreate parts of it. So I did a show called Not Gay Isn't Happy, But Queer Isn't Fuck You, which is a phrase. I had to figure out who had originally said the phrase. And I came back, there was a lesbian punk rock band from Seattle and I got a hold of them and they said, no, our friend just used to say it. We don't know who the origin was. This is Jan Ratia's work, who's here now in town. This got me banned from Instagram for a week because it's "fuck Trump" written in jizz, and it was done as a the Space Alabama song. They do one-night shows. They're based on Bruce High Quality Foundation here of doing one-night educational shows, And Violette Buell was in it too, and this is a piece she did back in Venezuela about certain abuses by the army there. So I ended up accidentally, I don't know how this happened, but those that know Houston, there's a lot of Latin American countries that are well represented there. And of the 9 artists in the show, I had 5 Venezuelans. And I didn't even realize until I was like, they were all talking to each other at the opening. I'm like, wait, everyone here's from Venezuela? And it was the show and it was a really fun night. Lovey Olivia, I did a show, the guy who runs 1969 Gallery in the East Village is from Houston originally. And he asked me if I could bring the painters from the museum show, but up the amount of Texans. This is Lovey Olivia, who's an amazing artist. This is called Open Carry, and I thought it was just about gun laws in Texas. And she's like, honey, that's a lesbian sex toy. And I'm like, it is? And she's explaining, you don't always want to use a strap on this, and it's like, I keep learning about these things. I also included Jane County, who had a retrospective of the visual work at Participant in New York about a year and a half ago. Jane was the first transsexual rock star. She was originally Wayne County the Dr. Chairs, and she did this incredible songs. Her first single was called If You Don't Want to Fuck Me, Baby, Baby Fuck Off, and then it was followed up by Toilet Love. And she's a little frail now, and she lives outside of Atlanta, and she does these things that look like Aboriginal paintings, but they're like all just kind of crazy sex dreams, as Jane County. And then I had this in the show. This is Steve Locke, this is Steve's actual photo from when he was like 10 years old. And he grew up in Detroit. And he got the double message, like God is love, God will love you anyway, but not if you're a faggot. So it's a really heartbreaking piece. It's a giant tapestry. And he's been putting the piece in all different forms. And it's also in my current show at Bill Arning exhibitions now. And the most fun thing was Christine, who lived in Austin for years. Have any of you seen Christine as a performer? She's makes records and performs, plays with Peaches. She just did a sold-out show at the Barbican in London where she recreated the Lion and the Cobra album by Sinead O'Connor from start to finish. But Christine did a live painting practice where she was in the back garden of the gallery, and she had a little Venmo machine, and you could get a painting of her and her cat, Pickles Tickles, and for $35. And I see some people in the room who now have them in their houses. When Christine was so popular in Austin, when she decided to leave and move to Bushwick a couple years ago, people were really, really upset. So there was a weekend theme party in Austin called Fuck You, Christine. And I'm determined to have her come back to Houston and do the painting piece there. So then there's a great alternative space outside of Manchester in the country called the Horse Shed, because it's in a horse shed. And you take the train to the middle of the country, and it is designed to have everything viewable online. And this is Rachel Hecker, but everything is like, who's a great painter, and she did these skull masks or masks last year. Around Lovey Olivia, who had Open Carry, had these studs on the wall. But the thing is, the show, it's like, they get like 6 viewers in person, so everything's designed so it's doable online. And you can still experience the show online. This is Chris Souter from San Antonio, and he asked the space to use scrap wood they had there and make testicles and ovaries combined and make it look like a shop sign outside. So this was outside. There was a guy who's a queer bluegrass musician who had an audio piece outside of the Handsome Cabin Boy, which is some strange transsexual sea shanty. That's real, it's authentic. Here you've got Lovey Olivia and this guy, Bob Morrissey, who you'll see on the next slide too, who's a stand-up comic. And so they're installed in this horse shed. Really an incredible experience. Then I was invited to do a show in Lincoln, Nebraska at a space called Fiendish Plots. And people have really big studios in Houston. And it's really common because real estate's cheap. I see all the artists like, you can have a giant studio if you want. And but I invited people who were really non-traditional. This is Bob Morrissey, who is better known as a stand-up comic. He organizes a comedy night called Gay Shame Parade. And if you follow his social media, he's always drawing his cats, and somehow they go into his common routines. On the right is Emilio Mitri, who's a punk rock bass player. And he was doing these things as just like posters and stuff. And I was like, do you ever show them in galleries? And he's like, no, I never thought about it. But they're like these sort of blocks and stuff. So I like the fact there was this unbounded creativity. This is Rick Lowe, the guy who founded Project Row Houses, who was interested in the fact that in the Third Ward, people played dominoes all day in their backyard. And it's a way how it's how the community organizes. So he does these domino drawings in tribute to it. The only MacArthur Genius Award winner in any of my shows. Matthew Kelly DeBout, who does these sort of crazy, hypersexual, dystopic self-portraits. They're unrolled canvas. I just feel bad. He just left town. He just moved to LA. And then my current show, I went to see Penny Arcade at Joe's Pub a few months ago, and she was talking about the idea that safe space is bad. She was invited to go to a school, and they're like, oh yeah, we're really involved in creating safe spaces for students. She was like, you want them to feel safe enough that they come to school, but in order to self-actualize, you actually need risk and you need challenge. And that was so much an important thought for me in my generation and she was like, you don't really find out who you are from not being confronted with stuff. So I decided to do a show called No Trigger Warnings, which is currently on view. And one of the first artists I wanted was Kathe Burkhart. Kathe is been painting Liz Taylor film stills, and she for something like 37 years. And she said she could talk about every important issue for women in politics and social world by looking at Liz Taylor film stills. And then this is Alton Delaney, who's one of the stranger Texas artists I know. He was invited to do a residency at the Tom of Finland Foundation, and they had this particularly dramatic dildo. And he asked for, and he put the word art on it, and it said Art Cock by Alton Delaney. He's actually running for mayor currently of a small Texas town called Splendora. And he also does all the art for the airports. I don't know if I can quite give you the sense of the size of this, but even my most sexually ambitious friends, none of them have wanted to break the glass and try this thing. It is huge. I had a lesbian comic, Keisha Hunt, performing in front of this the other night, and she's like, oh honey, if anyone wants to break the glass and use that dildo, I want to be here to see it. Colin Radcliffe's an artist in town here. This is actually an image called Ready Freddy, and it's based on the way people take their selfies on Grindr or Scruff. And weirdly, this is the most Instagram photo from the show. This thing is only about this big. And most people, in order to not get banned from Instagram, have just been photographing Freddy's face. And I just think it's so cool and so dramatic. I'm going to end with this image. This painting is huge. The title is Priapus, You Are My Girlfriend. It's by Scooter LaForge, who's in town. He had a he had a show, do you know this place, Howl Happening, on Lower East Side, that does a lot of work that's really edgy. He was looking at when you're a kid in art history classes and you see stuff like Pompeian murals that have like floating phalluses and stuff. And these are just sort of like stapled to the wall, and they're loose and they're crazy that. I have, so I got to write the essay for this, and I talked about the period before gay was allowed to be talked about, when it was still dangerous and illegal. And how I was the baby in my family. My sister was in acting school. Her room in my parents' house was full of gays. And I had no idea this was tied to sexuality. I just thought there were these crazy magical people. And like her best friend was this guy, a theater director named Victor Bumbelow. And I remember the name was like Victor Bumbelow. And I was this little pudgy, like 8-year-old. And they thought I was like charming and funny. And I would hang out in this room. And this was like a period when it was still super dangerous. And I remember my parents were talking about my sister, and my sister was 12 years older than me. And they were like very concerned that they thought she had fallen in love with her friend Randy. and that she didn't understand he was one of those homosexuals. And I'm this little chubby girl, so I'm like, oh mom, but she knows. They talk about boys all the time. I'm in there. And she's like, oh, you must have misunderstood. I'm like, no, I didn't misunderstand. I should have brought an image. Annie Sprinkle, who is one of the great feminists, lesbian makers of sexual material. We were picking out a piece of hers for the show. And her wife, Beth Stevens, have been doing a project called ecosexualism. If you say you love nature, you should make love to it. You should like waterfalls and lakes and boulders. And we screened their new movie called Water Makes Us Wet. And Annie and I were on the phone trying to pick up what we wanted for the show. And she's like, you know, Bill, you and I, we might be dinosaurs. Like, young people are really scared of the type of stuff we thought was liberation. And I'm like, I know, so I am like making this stand for what I think is the type of material that saved me. When I was getting ready for the Marilyn Minter retrospective, the Jeff Koons show was on view at the Whitney, the old Whitney. And I spent a long time looking to see the way they took his porn images and separated them out and the language they used in the guards. And I saw a bunch of 11-year-olds trying to get past the guards and get into the room. And I looked at the look in those 11-year-olds' eyes. They just knew that they weren't supposed to see what was in there and they wanted to see it. That was me. That is me to this day. And I found those 11-year-olds trying to get in to see the dirty Jeff Koons. That's what art world is to me, when it's the kind of art I found at CBGB's and ACT UP and all this stuff. So thank you.
Hi, I've also noticed that there's a kind of disconnect now, I think, between the, so I was an undergrad in the mid to late, like early aughts, or mid to late aughts rather. So we were reading like queer theory, we were reading Lee Edelman, we were reading Judith Butler and stuff like about queer subversion and, you know, queerness is kind of a foil or a challenge to heteronormative capitalist hegemony. Yeah. And I think that there's a disconnect among people who have kind of been politicized in the fight for marriage equality and fights for you know, equal rights. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about like the social dynamics that have informed this shift between like seeking out what's really radical and dangerous and like subversive versus other types of activism and the desire for safe spaces. Yeah.
Well, I do think the bulk of any community is going to opt for conservative values. The idea of getting married, having kids, moving to the suburbs is, for most folks, still the ideal. And to pretend that LGBTQ folks are any different is not true. Those of us who have an alternative sensibility are going to have, like, I was talking to William Basinski, the composer, once, and he said, yeah, you can make the idea of getting a seat at the table is awfully nice, but all the polite gays will be at the table and we'll still be in the corner, like, you know, like making fun of people. And I read that book, the Dubman book, Has Gay Liberation Failed? And it's a really fascinating book. And it talks about how every stage of gay politics, when there was a choice between being more radical and being safer, the gay movement has gone safer, which meant that in terms of the larger leftist movement, it's become trivial. The idea that our main fights were for marriage equality and stuff, it's just like, and not for world revolution, not for income, you know, not for anti-capitalism. So, but the book admits into it. It says, like, when they poll people, we always use the term the HRC agenda for the conservative side of that, of queerdom. And they said, you know, 80% of gay folks, what they want is the HRC agenda. And that's just, most people are conservative. And, but then I am really fascinated by what's happened in terms of the revolutionary value of the new gender norms. The amount of friends that have come out as non-binary and are still in this kind of sex radical space is really fascinating. I went to visit a kid who had come through my museum teen program, and they had just got out of the school there in Chicago, and they're doing these agitprop posters. And I was looking at their work, and they were like, it was so dangerous seeming. And they gave me a big poster that they had made and said, oh, do you want this? And I'm like, oh yeah. And I'm on the subway in Chicago carrying it. I'm like trying to figure out how to roll it up without hurting it because it's super hypersexual and stuff. And I was like, this is fascinating. I also, and this has been a recent interest of mine, there's an artist that I love. I put him in the 1969 show and is in my current show, who named Wes Holloway. And I wrote an article about him that is available online called Wes Holloway's Perfect Bodies. He, when he was 17 years old, had an accident and became paraplegic. And he, 2 years after ending up in a wheelchair, he came out as both an artist and as a gay man in a culture that obsesses about perfect bodies. And I started reading disability studies, which, like queer studies, the activists call it crip studies, as in cripple. And I remember calling Wes, and I'm like, am I supposed to be as a non-disabled person using crip studies as a term? He's like, well, I wouldn't if I were you, Bill, but that is the term, and people are like, yes, it's a crip studies conference. And I read this one manifesto piece saying differently abled bodies are like what queer does to the straight dumb, in that it provides an exploding encyclopedia of other possibilities. And the last paragraph in the article I wrote about Wes was a quote from him. They said, Wes, people, I've worked with your work now a bunch of times, and people keep asking me what kind of sex you have. And he said, Bill, anyone who shows up to have sex with me and is interested in dating me, if they have a list of the 5 sex acts they need, they're going to leave and be disappointed. But if they just say, we'll get naked and decide and figure out ways to please each other, they'll have a good time. And it said, so if they're exploratory, it's good. And this is, any sex that's not exploratory is probably not worth having anyway. And when he said that, I burst into tears. I was like, oh. So I still have this faith that if we follow, that each generation, a certain amount of people will freely follow their libidos and end up with radical liberation anyway, despite an overwhelming wave of conservatism. That's my little moment. Yes?
I just want to say that I think it's wonderful that you've gone west and landed on your feet and found freedom so far away. Does that have to do with, you feel that moving away from New York?
The reason I found freedom there is really practical. It's cheap real estate. Artists can do what they want there because you can buy a building. You can, if you, the No Zoning show, which I didn't go into in depth, it just said, artists in Houston have never waited for anything. They sit there, they're like, oh, well, I can rent this entire building for $150 for next week, and I'll do this massive show, and I'll have all my favorite friends' bands play. It's just a really great place to be. And I woke up there this morning, and I can fly anywhere from there, and it's just it's a great place to be based. 90% of the projects I've done since leaving the museum have been elsewhere. But when I do projects there, and I'm doing 4 projects, there's a space that's kind of a storied space on Dunleavy and Westheimer, right in the middle of the neighborhood. And I'm doing 4 shows there this year. And I can do that because real estate is cheap. And it opens a possibility. I did not know how galleries really made money, having been in the field for a while. So it's not like people walk through the door and they come and buy stuff off the walls. That's not how you do it. And I'm like, oh, I could be based in a city I really like, It is a fattening city. That is one problem as a gay man. It is. I did gain 22 pounds the first year. Now the biggest part of my weekly budget is my trainer. But it's like, but it's a really supportive city of the arts.
And just one more. Have you fashioned yourself after Walter Hopps, or?
You know,
I mean, Walter Hopps is just so wonderful.
Yeah.
It's just interesting to me that you've held on to him.
There's a lot of really interesting curators, and I never knew Walter. I met him once when I was at White Columns in New York, which I didn't really talk about the White Columns years very much. He was also not much of a writer. Like there's very little essays by Walter Hopps, and a lot of what I do now, I'm writing like crazy these days, which is really incredibly satisfying. And I always say it's like my writing room at home is so much nicer than my writing room in other cities I've lived in. I look out in my garden and stuff. And so I'm less Hoppsian because I'm more of a writer. And he was a little bit of the magician type who would put things up. When you would see a Walter Hopps show, they would always have really interesting juxtapositions. But I'm a little bit more pedestrian in terms of my physical installations. I like one object after another, less the like here's a shoehorn next to the deepin corn. Yeah. 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 You can also ask, we can talk one-on-one afterwards too. I'll be here. I can just hang out too if that's easier. Okay. Well, thank you for coming.